a few, and then monotheistic faiths too, that proclaim that God has sent prophets and messengers and revealed scriptures to the world. That's an even smaller number. And then if you're agreeing with all kinds of things about Jesus, that Jesus is born of a virgin, that he's the Messiah, that he lived the most miraculous life in history, you're down to Islam and Christianity as far as having that much in common. Now, Christianity has other things in common with, like Judaism has a ton in common with Judaism, but as far as that kind of overlap on Jesus and the things he did, lots of common ground there with Muslims. But the areas of disagreement just happen to be the core doctrines of the gospel. When the apostles go out and preach the gospel, it's Jesus is Lord, he died on the cross for sins, he rose from the dead. That's the core. That was the takeaway message according to the apostles of Jesus. And if you go to Islam, if Muhammad's coming along preaching, it's, hey, you Christians, you believe in one God? So do I. You believe that God sent messengers into the world? So do I. You believe Jesus was born of a virgin? So do I. You believe he lived the most miraculous life in history? So do I. You believe he's the Messiah? So do I. There are just these three little things we can't agree on that you need to change. Jesus isn't Lord. He didn't die on the cross for sins, and he didn't rise from the dead. Now, if we could just get those out of the way, then we're good.
Again, just to reiterate what David said, tons of things in common between Islam and Christianity, but the three things, I'd say the three things that stand out the most that they disagree on are the death of Jesus on the cross, his resurrection from the dead, and the fact that he is God. Those three things are the most important beliefs in the Christian faith.
And so if you're comparing Islam and Christianity, now as far as, before investigating them, since they don't teach the same things on core doctrines, they can't both be true unless you are declaring yourself Aristotle's nemesis or something like this and going against the law of non-contradiction. You basically have three possibilities. Either Islam is true and Christianity is false, Christianity is true and Islam is false, or they're both false. And if you're looking at that, if you're just looking at those three doctrines and comparing them, you basically have either Christians for centuries leading up to the time of Islam got their most fundamental basic doctrines wrong. They were wrong about the takeaway message of Jesus. Somehow the core message, they messed that up. They got the part right about him being born of a virgin, according to Islam. They got the part right about him being the Messiah. They got the part about his miracles being right. They got all that right, but they got the core message of the gospel. They got all that wrong. Somehow it was corrupted over time. It's either that, and Islam is true, or Islam is a corruption of Christianity. In other words, Islam picked up some things, and the reason it has things in common is because it absorbed those from, Middle Eastern Christians and Jews and so on. But it's actually a corruption, either an accidental corruption, like Muhammad was just listening to some weird Christians, or something darker and more sinister. And the reason you might want to think that is because if you look at the New Testament gospel and you pay attention to the message about false prophets coming and so on, I mean, you couldn't come up with a more perfect example of someone who says, guys, I agree with you on almost everything, just these three core issues of the gospel. The Christian response in Muhammad code, if Christianity is true here, then the Christian response should have been, we've been expecting you, right? We've been expecting you, Muhammad, because you are the perfect example of someone who's come along to change the gospel. So for you Muslims out there, those are the two possibilities. If you want to say Christianity or Islam are on the table here, either Christians got their fundamental doctrines wrong somehow, or Islam got the doctrines wrong.
So if you're
Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today I'm going to be making a brief video responding to the clip you just saw before this. So here we go. So basically David Wood is saying that people have three choices basically. He's saying that either Islam is true and the Christians corrupted their message. The second option is that Christianity is true. The central tenets or the central teachings of New Testament Christianity is true, that Jesus was divine or God and he died on the cross and he rose from the dead. Or three, both Islam and Christianity are false. So, I think he's saying that if Christianity and Islam is false, and I guess Judaism too, because of the Old Testament. But anyways, if all three Abrahamic religions are false, then atheism is the next answer, or something like, or he's saying something along those lines. So I'm going to be stating why it looks like Christians are corrupted their message, and Christians are just following conjecture, or they're following nothing but they're not following the true teachings of Jesus and Jesus' disciples. So here we go. First of all, he says that the central gospel, or the central message of Christianity, is that Jesus is divine. He's God, Son of God, and all that. And then Jesus died on the cross, and then Jesus rose from the dead, and that the disciples, Jesus' immediate disciples and stuff like that, preached that version of the gospel to people and things like that. Well, it's not. That's not the case if you do like a careful reading of the New Testament, and if you read scholarship, not just liberal scholarship, but conservative scholarship too. Since Christians always tell Muslims you have to cite conservative scholarship, that's fine. Conservative scholarship actually more or less agrees with liberal scholarship on some areas. But anyways, if you do a careful study of the origins of Christianity and of the New Testament and of the disciples and Paul and the historical Jesus and stuff like that, you'll see that Islam is actually right about a lot of stuff regarding Christianity. For example, the Quran says in the Quran chapter 5 verse 13 through 15 that the Christians have corrupted their message, that the Christians had a covenant with God and then they forgot that covenant, and then they corrupted their message as time went on. And this is true. If you look at historical Christianity, there were debates on whether Jesus was divine and stuff like that. And, there were different Christian groups, like the Ebionites believed that there was one God, and then other Christian groups believed that there were, a good God and an evil God, and other Christian groups believed in, like the Arian version of Christianity, where it says one God, and then Jesus was separate from God, and you have modalism, and you have Dicesium, and so you have all these early Christian groups that contradicted one another, and things like that. And then, and then if you, not only that, but if you read that, we don't have the original text of the New Testament. All we have are 3rd century copies or 2nd century copies, and these fragment manuscripts and stuff like that. So who knows what the original autographed New Testament states? We don't have accurate copies of the original autographs of the New Testament. So who knows what the original text actually says? A good book to read would be Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, and and other good books to read would be D.C. Parker. D.C. Parker wrote a book back in 1997, I think, where he talks about how it doesn't make sense to talk about the original text of the New Testament and things like that. And there are other scholars too, as well, that agree with that position. But anyways, and even conservative scholars would admit, yeah, there's forgeries in the New Testament, like the ending of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus' resurrection was, it originally ended in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 8 or 9, I think, and then somebody tacked on a whole other ending about the post-resurrection scene. So of course, people, so people were making up things in Christianity, putting it in there, and there were debates in the early Christian period and things like that. So yes, Christians did corrupt. There's evidence that Christians corrupted their message from the very beginning. And then it goes further, because if you read the letters of Paul, the disciples and Paul got into fights with one another, and they weren't preaching the same thing about Jesus. We read in 2 Corinthians and stuff like that, where Paul was getting into fights with the disciples. Paul and the disciples were preaching different things about Jesus. For example, James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader of the Jerusalem church, and things like that. James, if you read the book of James, whoever wrote the book of James, they were completely anti-Pauline. We see a lot of evidence for this. For example, in the book of James, it says that you have to keep the Mosaic law and stuff like that. It's Paul who said something different. It's Paul who said, yeah, you can, you don't have to follow the Mosaic law and things like that. So even within the New Testament is full of contradictions. In the books of, for example, if you compare the book of James to the letters of Paul, you see that there's two different sides here, and I don't believe James, the Apostle James, who wrote down the book of, or the letter of James or the book of James. I don't think that's the case, but if you just compare the book of James with the letter of Peter, you'll see there's massive contradictions in theology and things like that. So James and Paul, or whoever wrote the Epistle of Paul, whoever wrote the book of whoever wrote the book of James or the letter of James, they were anti-Pauline, or they weren't preaching the same thing Paul was preaching. So if you read, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 and 5, getting back to what I was saying about Paul and the disciples not getting along, it says, and again, I'm reading from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 and 5, it says, "For if someone comes and preaches another Jesus than the one you preached, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you submit to it readily enough. I think I'm not in the least inferior to those super apostles." So basically, Paul is saying is that there were opponents, or there were he had people who were opposing him and things like that. So Paul and the disciples weren't getting along. They were Christians who were followers of the disciples, and the immediate disciples would be James, Peter, John, etc., etc. So these opponents Paul is talking about is people from the Jerusalem church, or people from the disciples, immediate students of the disciples. I'll just put it that way. So then, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 22 to 23 says that the opponents of Paul were Hebrews, and they were Israelites, and they were descendants of Abraham. So Paul's opponents were Jews. So that means that they were the disciples of Jesus, because the disciples of Jesus were Jews, were all Jews. Peter, Peter, James, etc. So these were all Jews. So Paul and the disciples were preaching different things about Jesus. They were teaching. So Paul is the one who was preaching Jesus resurrected. Paul was the one who was preaching Jesus crucified and stuff like that. And you can see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. So people were preaching a different Jesus than the Jesus Paul was preaching, essentially. You see all these kinds of you see all these kind of very early Christian groups who opposed each other and stuff like that. And you can read this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11 to 12, where people said that, yeah, I belong with Peter, or I belong with Apollos, or I belong to Paul, and stuff like that. So there were many different early Christian groups, who opposed one another and were preaching different things about Jesus and stuff like that. So Paul and the disciples kind of did fights with one another. Or Paul and the disciples were preaching different things about Jesus and things like that. And again, you can read this for yourselves in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5, etc., etc. So there were basically, several different very, very early Christian groups, like the group of Peter, the group of James, the group of Paul, who were all preaching different things about Jesus. So it's not true to say that, the central teachings of Christianity were always that Jesus was divine, that Jesus was crucified, and Jesus was resurrected. No, because if you read the New Testament, the earliest books, the earliest writings of the New Testament, which would be, the letters of Paul, Paul and the disciples weren't getting along. They got into arguments, or they were teaching different things about Jesus. So, it's impossible to say. So, there's no way to prove that the disciples believed in the divinity of Jesus and the crucifixion and resurrection. There's no way to prove it. When Peter, or I'm sorry, when Paul says how Paul got his gospel is from visions in the Old Testament. You can read this in Galatians 1, in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says that visions in the Old Testament is where he got his gospel. What is his gospel? That Jesus was crucified and resurrected. Jesus died for the sins of man and all that stuff. But he got that from visions, subjective visions, in his subjective reading of the Old Testament. So he didn't get that from the from Peter, James, John. There's no evidence that he got it from that. And he says 3 years later he talked to the disciples, or he talked to Peter and stuff like that after he went to Arabia. He was in Arabia for some reason, who knows what. But anyways, in Galatians 1 you can read this. Paul's gospel is different from the gospel the disciples were teaching and stuff like that. So it's impossible. There's no way to prove that the disciples believed in Jesus' divinity, his crucifixion and resurrection. There's absolutely no proof for that whatsoever. Another good book I would recommend to read would be this book, Barterman's book, Forged, where he talks about how we don't know who wrote Acts of the Apostles. We don't know who wrote 1 Peter, 2 Peter, the book of James, and things like that. So he goes really into why 2 Peter's a forgery, and why Peter could not have written 1 Peter even with the help of a secretary, because people say, yeah, well, Peter had secretaries writing down, or writing down the letter of 1 Peter and stuff like that. But Barterman proves that that's not the case. That's actually false. And things like that. And then he talks about how Acts of the Apostles is also a forgery and stuff like that. Well, you might be saying, well, that's Barterman. He's an anti-supernatural liberal. You can't use him. And that's fine, because even if you read, the New American Bible, it says, for example, it says the Gospel of Mark is anonymous, and it says, what does it say? It says things like, 1 and 2 Peter is, we don't know who wrote, we don't know who wrote 2 Peter, and that's found in the New American Bible, page 1354. So according to, the New American Bible, which is conservative Christians editing and writing footnotes and commentaries. These are, again, conservative Christians, not liberal, not anti-supernatural liberals, writing this stuff, saying that, yeah, we don't know who wrote 2 Peter, and it says the book of Acts is anonymous. This is found in the NIV Bible commentary on page 1643. And it says things like the book of Hebrews is anonymous. So even the book of Hebrew doesn't identify himself. And this is from the NIV Bible commentary, page 1856. And the Gospel of John is full of inconsistencies. Again, this is found in the New American Bible, page 136. And things like that. So in 1 John, we don't know who the author is. It is found in the NIV Bible commentary, page 1904, and things like that. So according to the NIV Bible commentary, the New American Bible, the New American Bible commentary, and things like that. Even these, conservative Christians, even they say that, yeah, there's anonymous authorship in the New Testament. Like, we don't know who wrote majority of the books of the New Testament and things like that. And another good book to read would be Raymond Brown's book. Raymond Brown wrote a book called Introduction to the New Testament, and and where you read that book, where Bruce Metzger was a Protestant Christian scholar, so he's not an anti-supernatural liberal. But anyways, Bruce Metzger praised that book, and in that book, Raymond Brown states we don't know who wrote, Colossians, or we don't know who wrote, or a majority of scholars. When I mean scholars, I mean conservative evangelical scholars, not just liberal scholars. Say we don't know who wrote. We don't know who wrote Ephesians, or we don't know who wrote 1 Peter, or we don't know who wrote the book of James. The book of James is said to be pseudonymous. and we don't know who wrote Titus or 1 and 2 Timothy. These are pseudonymous works, according to Raymond Brown, an Introduction to the New Testament, page 639, 654, and 673. So these books are anonymous or pseudonymous. Like, we don't know who wrote majority of the New Testament books. When I mean majority, I mean Gospel of Matthew, 1, 2 Peter, the Book of James, the Book of Revelation, etc., etc. For example, Bruce Metzger says about the Epistle of the Hebrews that we don't know who the author is, and it was not written by Paul, and things like that. So we don't know who wrote the pastoral epistles, and we don't know who wrote the Book of James, and the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and 2 Peter, and things like that. So they're anonymous or pseudonymous works in the New Testament, according to Raymond Brown's Introduction to the New Testament. And again, Introduction to the New Testament, Raymond Brown's Introduction to the New Testament. Raymond Brown was not he was not an anti-supernatural liberal. He was actually a Christian and stuff like that. And Craig L. Bloomberg, who is a conservative evangelical scholar, even he states that we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. It is found in a New American Commentary, page 43. So we don't. Other, like, for example, Tom Wright, who's a prominent conservative scholar, states that we don't know who wrote the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He says none of the books name their authors. So there's anonymous. So my point is there's anonymous authorship in the New Testament and things like that. So we don't know who, according not just to liberals, not just Barnum and people like that saying that, but other conservative scholars and NIV, according to the NIV Bible and the New American Study Bible, and in their footnotes and commentaries. And again, these are conservative evangelical Christians writing these commentaries and these introductions in those NIV Study Bible and New American Bible. According to them, there's anonymous and pseudonymous words. So how can we trust people we don't even know? How can we trust the New Testament when we don't know who wrote it? So so none of that stuff about Jesus' divinity, his crucifixion, resurrection, none of that goes back to the disciples of Jesus. There's no way to prove that the disciples believe that stuff, because the New Testament, we don't know who wrote the New Testament, and we don't know who the sources behind the New Testament are. And, according to not just liberal scholarship, but conservative evangelical scholarship. So we don't know, who their sources are, and who wrote these. Who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, the Book of Revelation, Acts, the Gospel of John. We don't know who really wrote these sources, or we don't know who wrote these books, and we don't know who their sources are. So how can we trust the New Testament? That's what I'm saying. Thus, it's possible you can prove that stuff goes back to Paul. That's possible. But why should we believe Paul when Paul and the disciples weren't teaching the same thing? Paul is the odd man out. Paul was preaching a different thing than what the disciples were teaching. So why should we trust Paul? It doesn't make any sense to me. So that's just some of the. Christians have corrupted their scriptures. Christians have corrupted their message. Yes, that's there's a lot of evidence to support that. So when Islam denies Jesus' divinity, there's this really good website called biblicalunitarian.com. I'm going to post it in the link below, where this person states that, there's contradictions in, the New Testament about who Jesus was and things like that. For example, if you read various things in life, if you read, the Gospels carefully, there's contradictions all over the New Testament about who Jesus was and things like that. So according to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 21 verse 11, the crowd said Jesus is a prophet. The Gospel of Luke chapter 7 verse 13, it says Jesus is a prophet. The Gospel of John chapter 4 verse 19 says Jesus is a prophet. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 21 verse 46 says that Jesus is a prophet. The Gospel of John chapter 7 verse 40 says, the people thought that Jesus was a prophet. So Jesus himself, says that he's a prophet in the Gospel of Luke chapter 4 verse 24, and so there's all kinds of verses in the New Testament that seem to affirm the Islamic belief that Jesus was just a prophet. So there's all kinds of verses in the New Testament that seem to point that Jesus was just a prophet. So it's possible that Jesus' divinity developed as time went on. That's certainly well founded in the New Testament. If you read the Gospel of Matthew, or if you read the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, you can see that there's an evolution in Jesus' divinity and in his status. It goes up as time goes on. So there's all kinds of contradictions in the New Testament and stuff like that. So it's not unreasonable to say, yeah, the Christians have corrupted their message. The message was corrupt in the very, very early period of Christianity. So just because the New Testament was written early, that doesn't mean it's reliable. There's all kinds of problems with it. There's all kinds of contradictions and stuff like that. And there are some verses that point to Jesus being a prophet and the Unitarian position that there's one God. For example, Jesus says, worship the Father, and even in the Gospel of John, Jesus says worship the Father, and in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says worship God, worship one. The most important commandment is worship one God. In the Gospel of Mark and things like that. So you can see in the New Testament that it seems that there's passages in the New Testament that seem to confirm or affirm the Islamic position that Jesus was just a prophet, that people were preaching different things about Jesus, not necessarily his crucifixion and resurrection. It was Paul who's teaching those things. Sure, I have no problem submitting that, but Paul's not reliable to begin with. There's no reason to believe Paul, and that God is one, and Jesus is just a prophet and stuff like that. You can see this in the New Testament. You don't even have to go to like conservative or liberal scholarship. You can find these contradictions all over the New Testament and things like that. I'm going to be posting a link below on biblicalunitarian.com. This is a longer topic. I'm trying to keep this video as short as possible, so you can see verses that point to Jesus saying there's one God and things like that, and verses refuting the Trinity from the New Testament, from the New Testament books itself. So this isn't liberal or conservative scholarship saying this. Is from the verses of the New Testament and from the books of the New Testament and things like that. So yeah, Christians have corrupted their scriptures. They've corrupted their message. There's a lot of proof in the early Christian period and in the New Testament of this. So yeah, the earliest Christians got it wrong, and Islam just came to put people in the right path, the path of Jesus, the true path of Jesus, that there's one God, you should worship one God, and that Muhammad is the final. Jesus was a prophet at one point, sure, but now Christians and Jews and Christians have to follow Muhammad if they want eternal salvation and things like that. For the evidence for Islam, the evidence for the Prophet Muhammad, I recommend you see my video, Evidence for Islam. I made a big video talking about why there's good evidence that Muhammad is a real prophet, to support his prophethood and things like that. So I just recommend people watching that video. So that's all I want to say about this topic. So yeah, David Wood is, he's incorrect. Another thing about the false prophets. So David Wood says that Muhammad might be a false prophet because he was teaching different things and things like that. Now, who are the false prophets in the New Testament that the New Testament speaks about? According to 2 Peter 2, whoever wrote 2 Peter, but anyways, according to the New Testament, 2 Peter 2, it says there were false prophets among the people. So what that means is there are false prophets and false teachers already among the believers. So the New Testament's not saying 600 years later or 570 years later there's going to be a false prophet. No, according to the New Testament, 2 Peter 2, there's false prophets and false teachers already among the early Christians, or already among the New Testament period Christians. And you can see this further in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7 verse 15 to 20, where he says watch out for false prophets. So there are false prophets already amongst the early Christian period. It's not saying 600 years later there's going to be a false prophet. No. So, there's and you can read this further in the Gospel in 1 John chapter 4, verse 1 to 6, where it says that false prophets have gone out into the world. So what that means is there were false prophets in the New Testament period, in the early Christian period, and they've gone out into the world and things like that. And the prophet Muhammad can't be a false prophet according to the New Testament, because, if you read Acts of the Apostles and all that, there were prophets after Jesus. So Christians can't say Jesus is the last prophet or whatever, because according to the 1 Corinthians and Acts and all that, there were prophets after Jesus who were active after Jesus disappeared. And another reason why Christians can't reject the prophethood of Muhammad is because according to 1 John chapter 4, 1 John chapter 4 verse 3, it says, "But every spirit that does not 1 John chapter 4 verse 2, it says, this is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God." And the Prophet Muhammad said Jesus is the word of Allah, and Jesus is from God, basically. So Christians can't discount the Prophet of Muhammad, because according to the New Testament, whoever acknowledges that Jesus is from the flesh is a true spirit, is a true prophet of God. So all this shows that, yeah, Christians have corrupted their scriptures, and no, Prophet Muhammad is not a false prophet according to the New Testament, because Prophet Muhammad acknowledged that Jesus came in the flesh. So, so Christians can't discount Prophet Muhammad. And according to 1 Corinthians and Acts and stuff like that, prophets came into the world after Jesus. So, Christians can't say Jesus is the last prophet, or he's the, prophets can't come after Jesus, because according to the New Testament, prophets did come after Jesus. So all this proves that Muhammad was a true prophet, and the Christians, the very early Christians, corrupted their message. We see evidence from this from scholarship, New Testament scholarship, early historical Jesus scholarship, and you see this from the evidence from not just liberal scholarship but conservative scholarship too. And you see internal contradictions in the New Testament, and things like that, and forgeries in the New Testament, and anonymous, pseudonymous works in the New Testament. So how can we prove the New Testament? How can we trust the New Testament when we don't know who wrote the majority of the New Testament? So all this is proof that, yeah, the Christians have corrupted their scriptures. So yes, my answer is yes, the Christians got it wrong from the very beginning about Jesus' divinity, his death on the cross, and in his resurrection. And Islam just cleared this stuff up, saying, yeah, the true teachings of Jesus is what is the revealed history that Allah told the Prophet Muhammad, which is found in the Quran. So the Quran is just coming to correct previous beliefs and previous incorrect beliefs. And the previous incorrect beliefs would be the beliefs of the New Testament and things like that. So that's all I want to say about that topic. Thanks a lot. Another thing to keep in mind is that we don't know what happened to the disciples. There's no evidence that they died, that they believed they believed in the crucifixion and resurrection, and then they died for their belief in the resurrection. There's no evidence whatsoever that points to this. There's no evidence for this. I think the mission of the 12 disciples was a failure. The disciples made the original disciples of Jesus, Peter, James, John, etc., the ones that were handpicked by Jesus, made no impact in Christian history whatsoever. We know that a large part of Christian theology has its roots in the epistles of Paul, not the original 12 disciples of Jesus. So, we don't know what happened to Peter, John, Andrew, Thomas, and stuff like that. All the information that we have about them comes from these late 2nd century or 3rd century books, like Acts of Peter, Acts of Andrew, the Gospel of Peter, etc., etc. And these are late works. We don't know who their sources are. These are anonymous books. There's no way Peter wrote, the Gospel of Peter. There's no way Peter wrote Acts of Peter or the preachings of Peter and stuff like that. No, even conservative scholars say, yeah, we don't know who wrote these books and stuff like that. For example, if you read the Encyclopedia of Early Christianity, this person who's a Christian, who's not who's not like a liberal or whatever, anti-supernatural liberal, he says all the accounts of the disciples are contradictory, they're late, and they're unreliable traditions. So all the traditions about the disciples are contradictory, they're late, and they're unreliable according to Christian scholars, according to the Encyclopedia of Early Christianity and things like that. So we have so we don't know what happened to the disciples. History knows nothing about them. So the problem is that the original 12 disciples, the ones that were handpicked by Jesus, made no impact on Christian history whatsoever. A lot of Christian theology has its roots in the epistles of Paul, not the original 12 disciples of Jesus. So who knows what the 12, maybe it's possible, it's very possible that the 12 disciples of Jesus weren't preaching Jesus' divinity. They weren't preaching that Jesus was crucified. They weren't preaching that Jesus was resurrected. It was Paul who was, for some reason, who just came along and then just completely changed everything, saying, Jesus was divine, and he died on the cross for the sins of mankind, and he was resurrected, and things like that. So it's Paul who came up with the central teaching of the central teachings of the Christian gospel, which as David Wood says is the divinity, the Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection. So, but this theology has its roots in the epistles of Paul, and not the 12 disciples of Jesus. So so the Christian beliefs come from Paul, not the disciples. So the mission of the 12 disciples was a failure. The original disciples made no impact on Christian history whatsoever. The original disciples, Peter, Andrew, Thomas, James, etc., John, all these original apostles, all these original disciples, the one handpicked by Jesus, made no impact on Christian history whatsoever. Christian theology has its roots in the epistles of Paul, a man who never met Jesus, a man who got into fights with Jesus' disciples, a man whose only source for the gospel is his subjective reading of the Old Testament and his own subjective visions. There is no reason why we should believe Paul or listen to Paul. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever. So Christians corrupted their scriptures from the very early period. Just because the New Testament is early, that doesn't mean it's reliable. Just because Paul was writing very early, that doesn't mean he's writing reliable things about Jesus. So who knows? Maybe the false prophet that that is talked about in 1 John and 2 Peter and the Gospel of Matthew, maybe the false prophet is Paul that Jesus is warning about. Who knows? So that's all I want to say about the Christians, the early Christians corrupting their message, because there's a lot of evidence from liberal scholarship and conservative scholarship and from the New Testament itself that shows that the Christians were making up things from the very early period, and that the Christians weren't. Then there were different teachings about Jesus. The gospel was not uniform. There was no one gospel that said, Jesus was divine, he died on the cross, and he was resurrected. No, there were multiple. There were very early Christian groups that all opposed one another, who were all teaching different things about Jesus and things like that. So that's all I want to say about that. Thanks. So.